shaper is another one of our advanced tools that we use to do some of the advanced processes in our upper level advanced woodworking courses. When you first take the advanced woodworking courses, you may do a cabinet or a dresser or something like that, and your doors may be just a flat panel. But with the shaper, you may be able to do something like a raised panel door, where it has a decorative frame outside a nice raised panel, all solid wood. And you can also do things like decorative trim on pieces and things like that, just to dress a project up and kind of take it up a notch. The bit that's on here right now would have done the frame for the raised panel, and then we have this large bit here that would actually do the panel itself, the edges, and make that large decorative wooden panel. If you're not familiar with the shaper, I usually describe it, some people are familiar with a hand router, and it works very similar to a hand router in the aspect that it does the decorative edges and it does different processes to edges of boards so they can join together and things like that. But the shaper is obviously a lot larger, and it's mounted, so we take the wood through the workpiece or through the bit. Rather than take a router over the board, we take the board through the machine. Okay? And depending on which blade you are setting up and using on this machine, it actually runs in forward and reverse. So you can either run the board, if it's set up to run and cut from the right side, you're going to run the board from the right side this way. And if you're going to run the board and the blade is set up to cut from this side, you would put it in reverse and run it from left to right. Okay? So before we would do anything, obviously all safety aspects, operate only with instructor's permission, take care of jewelry, loose clothing, long hair tied back, have my safety glasses on. You always want to stay at least 6 inches away from blades with any machine. We talked about some of the scroll saw and the bandsaw. Obviously you have to be just a little bit closer than that, but rule of thumb to keep your thumbs is stay 6 inches away from all blades. For all shaping jobs, you want to make sure the fence is positioned so that it surrounds the cutter head as much as possible. You have a two-piece fence right here that's lined up straight across, and it goes pretty close to the blade right here so that you have a lot of support as you run that piece through the blade. Always make sure the fence is secure to the table, everything's adjusted and locked down and secured, lined up. If someone needs to use this for a project, I would help them set it up, make sure things are lined up and make the cuts that they need, that they're ready to go. You definitely want to use the fence for all your straight line cutting. It makes it very easy to run the board straight along the bit and get a nice clean cut. Make sure the fence on both sides is set in place, that it's lined up, and that will make it very easy for you. We have different types of guards and hold down devices that go onto the machine depending on what operation you're doing, what bit you're using. So you want to use the guard, the fence, and the hold down device anytime that you're using the shaper when it allows for you to set those up. We have a ring down here that goes around the blade. When the really large bit is on there, we don't have any rings around there because it fills up that area. But when you do a smaller blade, you want to use the insert rings to cover that area so that the piece actually couldn't drop down into the table. Always use push blocks. We have different style push sticks. Really on this machine, there are many different style push sticks that we use depending on the piece we're running through. The table here is actually set up as a miter gauge where the entire table slides. So we have jigs that we mount to this table that you can slide and go right across the blade with those, especially if you have to run the end of a board, something like this, it goes across. You want to make sure that your cutter heads are nice and sharp. Dull cutter heads can possibly cause a kickback. You want to make sure there's no broken bits. They're nice and sharp. Most of the ones in here, compared to industry, we use a lot less than someone that's running these several hours a day. So most of our blades are in nice shape and very sharp. We don't want to try to remove too much material in a single pass. If you have to take a large cut, such as the big bit that we looked at earlier for that panel, you actually set it up and you run your piece across, and you only take off maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and you have to move it at least 5 or 6 times until you take off the depth that you want. So you want to make sure that it's set up and you take off just a little bit at a time, or there's a good chance of kickback and it can split and break out your board. Never stand in line with the workpiece, or never stand behind the blade, just like with any of the other machines. If we are running this board from right to left, you would never want to stand on this side, because if it kicks back, it could hit you. Same thing if you're running from left to right, you don't want to stand over here, because if it kicks back, it's going to fly this way. Okay, and that's very important because, again, it kicks the board out very fast and it could hurt you. Okay, it's dangerous to shape narrow, thin, or short work pieces. So if you have to shape a small piece, it's a good idea to have a board that you can put behind it to help push it through, or you have a larger board. If we are running just a small strip like this, 3/4 by 3/4, you could run this entire piece through, do the edge, and then cut it off, and then run it again, and then cut it off again. So that way we'd end up with our really small pieces, but you run a larger piece in order to get those small pieces. Always feed the workpiece against the rotation of the cutter head. You can turn it on to check and see which way it's rotating. Make sure you never go in the same direction. If you go in the same direction, it's going to hit and bounce it away, and it could kick out and hurt you. Whenever possible, position the cutter head or the bit so that it's going to cut on the underneath of the stock. Okay, it's cutting from underneath, not on top. Couple things. First, if it cuts on top, it may throw the sawdust out towards you, and that could cause a problem. But it could also break out the top of the board because it's not supported. When it runs across and it's cutting the bottom edge, the table is helping to support that material as it's being cut, and it's not going to break apart. When you're getting ready to run your piece, you always want to inspect the lumber to make sure there's no knots or foreign materials in the board, especially it's free of defects. There's no cracks or splits, because running through this machine, if there's a crack or a defect in the board, it can actually blow apart as it runs across the bit and tears out. So just make sure it's a clear piece of wood, everything's ready to go, and also make a trial cut on a scrap piece of wood just to make sure that your settings are right and everything is lined up before you use one of your good parts, so that you don't mess those up. We have our blast gate. You can open the air for this when you need it, and the controls are right down here. We have our start and stop button. The stop button turns to the right and pops out, forward and reverse. We start it up. And as with any of the machines, you want to make sure that you stay with the machine until it stops running before leaving anything, and also before cleaning anything up. You want to make sure that everything has stopped and you're safe to get near the blade. If you notice where our bit is in place here, we have the bit, there's a roller above it that keeps the wood lined up at the correct depth of cut, and then we have a spacer, and we have 2 silver nuts here on the drive shaft that's connected to the motor, and one is a lock nut that's on the bottom. The spindle nut is on the top. You want to make sure the lock nut is underneath the spindle nut, because those are different sizes and they're different thread underneath, and what that does, the lock nut and the spindle nut are reverse thread to each other. So when you put that forward, one of them tries to loosen, one tightens, and when you put it in reverse, the other one loosens, the other one tightens. So they lock each other together, and they keep everything in place so that it can't come loose and can't come off the machine as you're using it.